So on my commute this morning, I want to address something that I see the Russian supporter crowd using through various levels of mental gymnastics, but using nonetheless to justify what Russia is doing to Ukraine. And it is this idea that the United States would do the exact same thing as Russia if, say, Mexico, a country on the U.S. border, formed an alliance, a military alliance with China or Russia. So let's bring that to its logical end, its logical conclusion here. The first thing that I want to address is the idea that Ukraine was even remotely close to joining NATO. They had expressed in passing, essentially, nothing official, that they wanted to join NATO, probably because they saw the writing on the wall of what they're dealing with right now. But the reality is, they were not even in NATO. They were not even in the process. They had talked about it with NATO leaders and had expressed that they potentially wanted to join. In fact, they were further along in the process, not very far along, but still further along in joining the European Union, a non-military-centric alliance. It has some military aspects to it, but it's not as robust as NATO. So when you try to tell me that if China had, or Mexico had joined in with China militarily, the U.S. would invade Mexico, well, that works maybe if Russia would have waited if they were at least in the formal process of joining NATO. But instead, they invaded NATO on a whisper. That's like Mexico saying, yeah, we're kind of thinking about joining up in this military alliance with China, and then the U.S. rolls over its borders and starts committing war crimes. That's not a thing. That was not going to happen. That's not a very sound line of thinking. That is a bullshit excuse made by children. Countries are allowed to form alliances. Countries are allowed to conduct business as sovereign nations without the threat of attack. Russia has proved that if you are a neighbor to Russia, that they will use violent coercion to do such a thing. The U.S. doesn't have to use violent coercion. And that's not saying we haven't gone to war, because we absolutely have. But that's because all other means have failed. Russia didn't even run through the gamut of means to try to limit Ukraine, because it was never about stopping them from joining NATO. It was about taking Ukraine's resources, controlling Ukraine's people, and controlling access to various critical strategic waterways and lanes, namely the Black Sea. So the reason I say this is because there is an actual country that is more militarily powerful than Ukraine on Russia's border in the process of joining NATO, has formally applied, has absolutely been accepted by a good majority of the countries that would approve such an effort to join NATO, and Russia's doing not a thing about it. That's Finland, and also Sweden. Finland actually sits closer to Russian population centers. Finland is more dangerous to Russia on paper than Ukraine is. However, what Putin saw is also, they're not even in this, they're not like this brotherhood that supposedly Russia says they have with Ukraine. They clearly don't have that with Finland. So again, not a valid argument. If it was about NATO, why is Russia not immediately dealing with Finland? Because they know they can't. And it's not about NATO. NATO countries have sat on Russia's border for decades, and not a single NATO soldier has moved into Russia in a belligerent manner. Not a single NATO soldier has attacked Russia. Not a single NATO general has ordered the attack of Russia. NATO was never a threat to Putin, and Putin knew this. Putin knew this all along. What is a threat was the European way of thinking, free market democracies. And Ukraine was going that route, which meant that they were going to be exiting Russia's sphere of influence. Not only do they have the resources there's a trifecta of absolute reasons for why Russia did this. The reason, obviously, the resources which I just mentioned, and which include their human capital, their population, which Russia has a faltering population. But also, Ukraine for the longest time was politically aligned with Russia, with the new administration, which I don't give a shit what anyone says. They were voted in. There was not a fucking coup. The Euromaidan revolution was conducted by the people of Ukraine. Anyone who says that it was a CIA-led coup completely discounts the will of the Ukrainian people. So that is complete nonsense. That's a whole nother TikTok. But Ukraine represented the future for Russia if Putin wasn't careful. I would argue that Belarus is probably next on the list of countries that they almost had one. They almost had their own revolution, but Putin had to step in and protect his buddy. Couldn't protect his buddy in Ukraine. This was never about NATO. This was always about making sure Ukraine was on the same page as Russia, making sure that Ukraine capitulated to Russia, making sure that Ukraine's resources were never connected to Europe, but always connected to Russia. And the minute that started going away, NATO became a convenient scapegoat for them to say that Ukraine was going to somehow attack a nuclear, at the time, what we thought was a nuclear, at least regional power. Not even that anymore. They're just a nuclear country like North Korea. That was their excuse. NATO was going to attack them, despite the fact that that was so unfathomable. That's a word for the morning right there. That Western nations laughed at the idea. But that was Russia's reason. They spun their population up, scared them, and that was the reason they told the Russian people they were going to invade Ukraine. They made up some bullshit, a bunch of things about Nazis, a bunch of things about NATO, but in reality, it was Ukraine was leaning, like every other former Soviet nation, was starting to realize, hey, the West isn't so bad. They provide us this opportunity, security, safety, and the ability to grow. Russia wasn't doing that. Dictators are very rigid in that realm, in their ability. The only reason, this is a whole other TikTok too, the only reason China was successful under a dictatorship is they literally copied the American and Western playbook. It's starting to fail now because you can't just copy people and maintain an edge. Again, a whole other TikTok. I'm going off the rails here. Bottom line, it was never about NATO. The argument that if Mexico suddenly became an ally to China is bullshit. And then one final point, the reason it's bullshit is I asked these Russian supporters, so you're telling me that if there was this specter of Mexico joining up with Russia or Canada, you're cool with the United States invading them and doing what Russia has done to Ukraine? You mean to tell me that you would be totally for if Mexico just said, you know what, I think I'm joining China in a military alliance, not even actually doing it, just kind of thinking about it and talking about it out in the open, that the United States would be justified in invading Mexico? Fuck out of here. You know what you're talking about. The rest of you have a good day.